Um, I started my career actually in the restaurant business. My father, when I was 7, 8 years old, he would bring me in the restaurants on a Saturday or Sunday. He would do his business with the manager, and he would say, Steve, pair yourself up with a food server before the restaurant opened and learn how to make a root beer float, a hot chocolate, a milkshake. And so I started becoming indoctrinated when I was 7, 8 years old. Then also I moved into the kitchen, grinding meat, double grinding meat, making patties by hand on 6x6 wax, and scooping them up. That's how we used to do it. So I started actually getting involved in the restaurant business when I was 7 or 8, but I started working in the restaurant as an employee when I was 15, part-time, working on Saturdays and part-time during the summers. Started washing dishes. And then after 6 months after washing dishes, I started cooking. And I did that all through high school, again, just working Saturday and again, part-time during the summer. And then after my high school years, I started college. And because I was vulnerable to get drafted into the Vietnam War and didn't want to do that, I got in the Air Force Reserve, did my 6-week training in Texas, then went back, started reserve meetings. And then about 6 months later, we got activated. USS Pueblo, which was an intelligence ship, got seized by the North Koreans. President Johnson at that time called up 100,000 air transport unit. And I was in an air transport unit in Hamilton Air Force Base, which is in Marin County, and I was in food service. And so all of a sudden I had to drop out of college, and I was full-time in the Air Force for 2 years. And I was a mess sergeant. And we fed about 500 airmen a day. And it was actually great training in the food service, different perspective of food service than working in private industry. The standards are actually very high in the military, and I learned a lot. So after I finished the military, went back to college, finished one degree, got another degree. Then I came back into Zims on a full-time basis, and I started as a manager trainee. And then I became an assistant manager, and then a general manager. And then I opened about 5 or 6 new restaurants from scratch that we had, taken over, either restaurants that had failed or built out new restaurants. And I opened them up as the general manager, did, the hiring and training of the crew and implementing new menus, et cetera. So, and then I got involved in the company overall and doing research and development, new menu items. I did our stores in San Francisco were union. I negotiated, with the union, negotiated new leases, was involved in putting together training. So I had a whole myriad of different experiences working in the restaurant business. I eventually became the CEO of the company. And in our history, we had a total of 37 restaurants. So I had 20 years of, hands-on operating experience in the restaurant business. The business eventually went out of business by our choice. We had some union issues as a result of my father joining the union in 1947, and most other restaurants were not. And it was very difficult economically to have parity. But that's another story for another day. I'm not going to go down there. But anyway, I learned a lot, and it serves me well for what I do now. I also got after college, involved in real estate investments on a small scale, and then eventually over the years expanded my real estate investing. So I've been involved in commercial real estate as an investor for 50 years. So I started after Zims wound down. I worked for a general business brokerage company to learn the basics of business brokerage, because I had never, actually functioned as a broker selling a restaurant. If we sold underperforming restaurants, we'd use another broker. And who actually, when I decided I wanted to become a restaurant broker, I went and I approached this one restaurant broker, and I said, hey, could I come work for you? And he was a single practitioner. And he said, no, I don't think that would be a good idea, because you're going to learn all my trade secrets and you're going to take all my business away. So I said, fine, thank you. And so I went to work for this general business brokerage company. And the owner of the company, when I interviewed with him, when I approached him, I said, listen, I want to just specialize in selling food and beverage businesses. I want to specialize, because I've done a lot of diverse things over my career, between my real estate investments and the restaurant, different concepts in the restaurant business, et cetera. And he said, "Oh, that's fine. You can specialize, but you're going to end up being a general business broker. You're going to sell all kinds of businesses, laundromats and gas stations and, grocery stores and all this." I said, "No, I really want to specialize." He says, "Okay, well, if you want to do that, that's fine. Go ahead and do it. But you'll see, you'll be a general business broker." So after a year at this company, I learned the basics of business brokerage. I was the rookie of the year. I think I did 6 deals, and they weren't big deals. They were small deals, but I learned the basics pretty well. So I left there after 1 year. And in January 1996, I started Restaurant Realty Company. And I was a sole practitioner for the first 8 years. Basically working, 80 to 100-hour weeks, and ended up, finding a niche that really worked for me because I could walk the talk with my prospective new clients, my sellers, because I was a seller, I was an operator, and subsequently, I'm a restaurant landlord and a hotel landlord, so I understand the landlord side, really well, and have empathy, for the landlord, as well as having lots of empathy for the tenant because of being on both sides of the equation. So anyway, over the years, I've expanded, obviously, and we've become the largest restaurant brokerage company in California. We've completed over 1,500 transactions, leased over 3 million square feet of commercial space, sold over 70 commercial buildings, et cetera. So I finally found something that, seemed to work. What I did was, I started in 1996. I started writing these articles. In fact, if you go to our website and you look under Restaurant Wrap in the news section, you'll see that over 100 articles. And I use that as the basis for a book I wrote called The Restaurant Dealmaker. Hence, that's how this show name came about. And basically, I write articles that I think are appealing to both food and beverage sellers and buyers and landlords even. And so that's how I actually got to this particular topic, because the most recent article that I wrote at Restaurant Wrap just about 30 days ago is called "The 10 Essential Principles Buyers Need to Know When Purchasing a Food or Beverage Business." And thus, that I thought it would be helpful to share these points with you. Not only are important principles for buyers, but also for sellers. And so, as such, I'm going to be talking today, not all 10, and I'm going to show you those 10 right now. And you can also read them in the most recent article. But here they are. Hopefully you can read this. Today, I'm going to be talking primarily about number 1. How can the buyer make sure he is paying the right price for the business, which is obviously one of the most important factors a buyer has in mind initially when he is going to be purchasing a business, that he's buying it at the right price. And so we're going to be talking probably most, if not all, of today's session about that. These other topics I will talk in the future. Starting next month, again, we will have I'll have a co-host, and for the next few months. But in between that, I'll be talking about some of these other items, and we'll let you know. So the other important points that we'll be talking about in the future: number 2, realizing the advantages of buying an existing built-out food and or beverage business versus buying one from scratch. Number 3, having an understanding of the operations, marketing, financial, and legal aspects of the food and or beverage business, as well as understanding, a very minor point, how to deal with people. Obviously, that's one of the most underlying points for anybody's life in the business world, personal world, or otherwise. Number 4, how much money does a buyer need to open and operate a food and or beverage business? A lot of people think, okay, I'm paying $150,000 for the restaurant. That's all I need. And maybe a few closing costs, blah, blah, blah. But when you start factoring in, operating reserves, deposits, any remodeling costs, et cetera, that number could sometimes double. So there's a whole science in trying to figure out, how much actual money you need to open and operate a restaurant or a food and beverage business. Number 5, a very important point, and probably the most important point in getting a deal done, is how do I get approved by the landlord? And when we screen a prospective new buyer, most of our sales are confidential sales. which means the name and the address is not given when you see it on our website. So you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then you're screened by either our buyer manager or buyer coordinator. And after you're screened, if you're financially and operationally qualified, then only will we give you out the information. And the reason we do that is because we want to make sure that you're going to get to even though you may have an offer that may be acceptable to the seller, that's not going to do any good unless you get approved by the landlord. So there's a whole technique in trying to get approved by the landlord. And if you're, you don't meet the criteria of the landlord, that we will give you some suggestions on how you can somehow circumvent their normal criteria and still get approved by the landlord. And we'll have that discussion in the future. Number 6, how does the buyer evaluate the location to make sure it is the right location for the proposed concept, assuming you're not purchasing an existing successful concept? In other words, and we're going to be talking about this, an asset sale versus a going concern sale. An asset sale is one where you're buying the location, but not the name, the proprietary items, et cetera. So you want to make sure that your concept is going to work in this particular location. So how do you go about, assuring yourself that, everything's going to line up properly and you have a good chance of being successful there, assuming you operate properly. Number 7, what are the basics in negotiating a good tenant's lease and or assuming an existing lease? That ties in with number 5, getting approved by the landlord and also getting an acceptable lease or an assumption of the lease. And number 8, understanding how to complete the due diligence process in the purchasing stage. Due diligence is a fancy word for saying, how do I basically complete all the necessary inspections, examinations of the books and records, the physical inspections, make certain that the premises meet, American Disability Act requirements, the fire code requirements, everything's up to speed with change of ownership, health department inspection, et cetera. And then also, talking about, as far as due diligence, obviously getting the lease negotiated and or transferred if it's an assignment of a lease, transfer of licenses, if there's an ABC license, an entertainment license, if it's a franchise, getting approved by the franchise, and if there's financing, obviously getting approved by the lender. So this is all part of that process, and we'll have a lengthy discussion about that in the future. Another very important fact is, especially because I live in Marin County, and Marin County just basically published in the local paper, we got the lowest unemployment rate in California. Isn't that wonderful? Like 3%, and which makes it very tough to find employees. So obviously you want to make sure you have a market, for of perspective. You have availability of the labor market for your location. I was contacted by an individual the other day, got a well-known business, but it's in a very remote area, and he wants to sell. And I said, well, how's business? He says, well, I've been closed since October 22. I said, oh, really? And so I assume that's probably largely because he's in a remote area and it's very hard to get employees, and that's a reality. And number 10, is the concept and physical plant COVID friendly? This one has obviously come into play since COVID in 2020, and people want to make sure, there's enough space in the dining room, or there's enough outdoor space, and there's a good, delivery and takeout component to the business in some cases. So those are whole new considerations as a result of COVID. So today we're going to be talking about how to make sure you're paying the right price for the business. There are 4 basic valuation methods. So when we're hired by a seller, or basically interviewed by a seller to list their restaurant, the first thing we do is we do a broker opinion of value. So what we typically do is we look at 3 to 4 years of tax returns. We look at the current year's year-to-date P&L. Year-to-date means an accumulation of all the income and expenses, through, like right now, it would be through July 30th. We look at that P&L, and to corroborate the sales for the P&L, we also like to look at the sales tax returns to make sure they mesh, with the sales reported on a P&L. So we do that. We look at the lease. And then obviously we inspect the premises and look at the equipment, look at the, the state of the general plant. Does it meet ADA requirements? Is it up to health department standards? Do they have a proper airflow in the hood system? A whole myriad of different, visual inspections that we do to get an idea of, what is going to be needed to bring this physical plant up to speed, or is it currently up to speed? So that enters into our evaluation process. And obviously the lease is very important. So the first method is what we call the assets in place valuation method. And that basically means, and this was a method that we use largely when we opened new restaurants, our family. We would buy what are called multi-generational restaurants. So there was an initial restaurant there. It failed. Second restaurant came in at the same location. It may have failed. Third restaurant may have failed. I know this one particular situation. We had a corner of Van Ness and Jackson in San Francisco. We used to be in a very nice motor hotel, and since then it's not there anymore. And there's a high-rise residence there. But we were the 9th restaurant that went into that space over about a 12-year period. There were 8 restaurants before us that went into this space. We basically retrofitted in a restaurant that had already been retrofitted 8 other times before us. And so we didn't have to do a lot other than to make sure it looked like our restaurant, change the color scheme, change the finishes on the booths, had to realign some of the equipment in the kitchen, change the signage, etc. But the fact is we had a 25-year run there. And so there are several situations where if you have the right concept, the right location, and you execute properly, you give the right, you have the right price value, you give good service, good consistent quality food, good chance you're going to be successful, as was the case for us there. And I've seen a lot of those kind of situations with other restaurants, that take advantage of multi-generational restaurant that has been there before. They already paid the big bucks to put in the grease traps and put in the HVAC system and do all the heavy mechanical costs and the F&E. And so you just got to come in there and retrofit that. And you'll end up spending, a third probably or half of what it would cost if you had to build out that space from scratch, which we'll talk about another thing. So anyway, an assets in place valuation method basically means that the business is not profitable, it's marginally profitable, or there could be a situation where it is actually profitable, but the owner wants to sell it because he may have other operations with the same name. I'll give you a specific example. I sold this pizza restaurant in the Mission District of San Francisco. He had 5 other restaurants in San Francisco, and he had one that was less than a mile away. And this unit was, let's say, underperforming compared to his other restaurants. It wasn't doing as well. He was making money, but he felt that if he sold this restaurant, he would decannibalize his restaurant that was less than a mile away. In other words, that restaurant would pick up, if he closed this restaurant, a big part of the business in this location. And so as such, even though it was making money, it was an asset sale, because when we sold it, we didn't sell the name. We didn't sell the proprietary items, which means the website, the email address, the trademark, the standard operating procedures, the recipe book. They're basically buying equipment and fixtures, leasehold improvements, and a lease in place. And if there's an ABC license, a beer and wine license, that may be transferred. So in that kind of situation, even though the business is making money, that's an exception to the other situations where most asset sales, the owner's not making money, or he's making very little money. And I would say of our total sales, maybe 40%. It's really hard to quantify because it varies from agent to agent in our company. So I would say probably 40%. Some agents sell more than that as asset sales. And asset sales, basically the formula for coming up with a price, this is the general formula, so don't hold me or my agents to this verbatim. There are variables that will differ from these metrics that I have spelled out here. But basically, we take the sales price, divide by the yearly sales, and we come up with a percentage of sales. In other words, the relationship between the sales price to yearly sales. So for example, if you're doing $500,000 in sales and you sell it for 100,000, that's 20%. So that's how we come up like with the 20%. So if we look at our sales comps, and our sales comps are derived, we don't go back, since we've been in business for going on 30 years, we don't go back 30 years worth of data to come up with our metrics. We look at what we feel is the most relevant information, and we feel that information in our analysis currently is 2017 to 2022. So if you read on the bottom, we use the period 2017 to 2022 in our analysis, with 44% of our total sales comps coming from 2017 through 2019, the pre-COVID years, and 50% of our total sales comps coming from 2020 through 2022, the COVID and post-COVID years. By putting a close to equal balance of factoring the pre-COVID years and the COVID and post-COVID years, we feel we have created a truer snapshot of the current and future market. So what we've done is that businesses that are doing less than $499,000 a year in sales, our average metric comes out to about 25.96. They sell for an average of 25.96 of sales. Let's say, just say for discussion purposes, let's just say 25% because it's an easier number to work with for discussion purposes here. But if a restaurant's doing 500,000 in sales, it's not making money or very marginally profitable, it's going to sell for approximately 125,000, which is 25% of 500,000. Now, there are exceptions to that. That's a general rule. The exceptions would be, suppose it has a ABC type 47 license, which means it has the ability to sell full liquor, beer, wine, and hard liquor. In San Francisco, that license today is currently worth 170,000. It was before COVID close to 300,000. Obviously, there's a lot of licenses on the market because a number of restaurants have closed that have licenses. So there are a lot of these 47 licenses floating around. So, and suppose this particular restaurant we're evaluating, it's not making money, but it's doing 500,000 in sales, and less than 10% of its sales, let's say 50,000, is coming from alcohol sales. And you have that liquor license there that's worth 170,000. So you're saying, well, geez, how can you sell the place for $125,000 approximately if the license alone is 170? Well, obviously you're going to make an adjustment for that, especially since it's underutilized license. So there will be an adjustment for that. Another adjustment could be, and we don't see very many of these around anymore, we used to see a lot of them, long-term below market leases where rents were maybe 60%, 70% of what the market value should be. And what we could do is do a net value discounted analysis of that lease. In other words, take all the difference between what the market rent was and what the rent would be with a below market lease and bring it back to today's value. But again, we don't see many of those. And most landlords, unfortunately, have gotchas in their lease. So if there's an assignment, they have these little things that, quirks in there, like, if you ask for an assignment, there could be a recapture provision, which means they have the right to take the place back, or they get a % of the proceeds, or all kinds of these other little goodies, which gives them the ability to basically take a below market lease and bring it to market. So that's not going to be a reality. But anyway, getting back to assets and place valuation, you've got to excuse me if I get a little bit off on tangents, but I'm so passionate about this business, I have a tendency to do that. So to show you a snapshot of this basic structure. So as you can see, as the sales go up, if I'm selling a restaurant that's asset sale between $500,000 to $999,000, the metric goes down quite a bit. And again, these are based upon hundreds of comps. We only use our own comps. We don't use anybody else's comps. The only exception to that will be if we're selling a franchise. And if we're selling a franchise, they have their own set of criteria for selling, and they will vary depending upon the popularity of that franchise. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about going concern sales, which are sales that are evaluated on a different basis and using a multiple of seller's discretionary earnings, which I'll talk about shortly. But let's just stick with the asset sales formula, which again are businesses basically that are marginally profitable or not making money. So as you can see, this metric keeps going down if we're selling a restaurant $1 million and up, what happens with these big restaurants that are doing maybe $2-3 million and are losing money? They're losing money is because they've spent so much money on capital improvements and building out the space. They have, heavy occupancy costs because they have a big amount of square footage, and then that requires a lot of employees. So a lot of operating costs, and consequently it's bigness can be big reward, but big risk. And unfortunately, the ones that are marginally profitable or losing money are big risk. And consequently, we end up selling restaurants that may have cost millions of dollars to build out, and the seller is lucky to get hundreds of thousands of dollars in return. And that's just a factor that, there aren't a lot of big players that want the big restaurants, the big spaces. They don't want that big risk factor, the added risk factor of that heavy overhead and heavy occupancy costs staring them in the face, each month. So, and then we use a combined method in some cases, if it's sort of a hybrid type of restaurant that, is maybe a little different, et cetera. But generally speaking, we use these three basic categories and make adjustments, as I've indicated earlier, if it has a underutilized, hard liquor license, et cetera, or it has some unique features to it. But let's talk about, this is just a small portion of our template, our valuation template for an assets in place transaction for lower volume units. And typically in this template, we have, probably, close to, probably hundreds of comps that fall in this category. But our average is around 25.96. Actually, these numbers have been going down over the years because restaurants' margins generally have been going down over the years, even if you take out COVID, because in California, and that's why a lot of national chains, you won't see the typical proliferation of numbers of units of big nationals in California that you will see elsewhere because of the high operating costs of doing business in California, high rents, high labor cost, just high costs, insurance, all the way down the board. So margins are much less. To give you an example, one year I was a speaker at the National Finance and Real Estate Development Conference in Las Vegas, and they had a panel of different brokers from different parts of the country, and I was talking about California, and the general consensus in that whole conference was, folks, we have to show, basically a lot of these companies are public companies and they have to show earnings per share. Folks, we love California, but we don't want to do business there. It's too expensive to do business in California. We cannot get the return on our investment in California that we can elsewhere. Like go to Texas and you can get the minimum wage for front of the house people. One time you could get it down to like $3 or $4 an hour, where they have tip credit and meal credit. Those things don't exist in California. You have to pay a premium for labor. You have to pay a premium for occupancy costs, for insurance, for all the costs down the board. So it's tough to do business in California, and consequently, we find that the metrics have gone down over the years. Just for example, the assets in place formula probably 8 or 9 years ago was closer to 30%, which has dropped, down to 25%. So that's the template for 499 or less. For 500 or 990. Again, our template, shows an average. And again, this is just a small sampling of literally hundreds of businesses that we have sold in the 500,000 to 999,000 sales range. And again, these are just general numbers, and they will be manipulated, sometimes modified depending upon different circumstances. Sorry, you can't read this one that well, but this is for $1 million and up, and that's 15.96%. So the higher the volume, generally, those restaurants that are marginal, the marginal ones, the bigger ones, are losing a lot more money proportionally because of the extraordinary heavy overhead costs that they endure. So that's sort of a general overview on how we evaluate asset sales. Obviously, there's a lot more details that go into it, but just to give you a general overview on how we come up with the pricing. And again, it's all predicated upon past history of sales that we have done. We're not pulling numbers out of the air. We're actually looking at actual data that we have gone and lived with. So now let's talk about the more pleasant side of valuation, which we call the going concern method. And what is the going concern method? It means that we're selling a business that is profitable, and the buyer is desirous of maintaining the concept. They want to keep the name. They want to keep all the brands. They want the trademarks. They want the websites. They want the social media accounts. They want the recipes, the menus, the standard operating procedures, front of the house, the back of the house. They want the whole show. And as such, those businesses cost more. And the risk factor is obviously much less if you're buying a going concern versus buying a asset sale, where you're basically, starting from scratch, so to speak, with a new concept, a new name, a new menu, et cetera. So with the going concern method, there is less risk, assuming you can maintain the continuity of a going concern business. So what are the factors that we consider when we're talking about a going concern? Well, obviously, in determining the value, we're very interested in the lease. How long is the lease? What's the rent relative to the market rent? If there are options, are the options at fair market rent, or are they capped at some number, or they preset with some number, just a continuation of, let's say, a cost of living adjustment or a set amount? Leasehold improvements, the quality and the quantity of the leasehold improvements are very important. Leasehold improvements are basically items that go into the restaurant that actually belong to the landlord. There are things that are attached, like the electric system, the sprinkler system, if it's not provided by the landlord, the restrooms, if you have to build them out. Once those things are built, the hood system, the duct system, once you build that into the restaurant, usually anything that's attached and your lease expires, those things stay with the restaurant. The only things you can sell, basically, if you're selling the restaurant, let's say you go out of business, the only things you can move are the movable equipment. So anything that's fixed usually belongs to the landlord. Those generally classified as leasehold improvements. Fixtures and equipment are items that you can generally move. So the quality and quantity of the leasehold improvements, the fixtures and equipment, all play into the value of the restaurant, as well as, of course, the name, the menu, the concept, licenses, whether you have an ABC license or you have an entertainment license or you have some unusual license. The alcohol license is the main one. And goodwill. Goodwill means the reputation of the restaurant. This is sort of intangible. The customers flow, the reputation, past history, et cetera. And of course, the cash flow. And the cash flow is really the underlying motive for a buyer to look at an opportunity. And so the basic formula for a going concern valuation is we take a multiple of the earnings, and we work off the tax return. And if we're working with the current year, obviously we don't have a tax return for 2023. That won't be done until after December 31, 2023. But we look at, obviously, the year-to-date current year is very important, especially in light of COVID, because some restaurants, as we know, got obliterated in COVID and just died. In fact, 3 months into COVID, the California Restaurant Association declared that 1/3 of the 80,000 eating and drinking establishments in California would no longer open. So you're talking about, a third, 24,000 supposedly have disappeared or gone. I don't know how accurate that was, but that was the statement they made then. So needless to say, a lot of places went under because of COVID. There are some restaurants that really thrived. In fact, the example I'm going to show you of a going concern valuation is a pizza restaurant, an independent pizza restaurant that actually had its best year in COVID, because they were positioned with 60-70% of their business takeout and delivery before COVID, and they've been in business for many decades, and they had a great reputation, and their businesses went zoomed through COVID. So there were some exceptional restaurants that were basically structured, for heavy takeout, heavy delivery pre-COVID that did, just fine. But unfortunately, a lot of places, as we know, suffered dramatically. So, we when doing our analysis, we sort of put 2020 aside if those restaurants that got devastated, basically threw off the numbers to such an extent. So we just threw out 2020 in a lot of cases. So talking a little bit further about the going concern method, we take a multiple of what is called seller's discretionary cash flow. We also call that seller's discretionary earnings and discretionary earnings. They all mean the same thing, but we generally use SDE because it's short and sweet. And so we take a multiple of SDE. So what are we talking about when we talk about SDE? Okay. So we look at the tax return, and we look at the net income, which is on the first page of the tax return, and then we add back one working owner's salary, assuming the owner is working in the business. We add back his salary. We add back any personal expenses that he charges to the business, such as if he takes food for home. Let's say he's got a family of 4 and he takes food for home. And so it's approximately, it will vary from $500 to $1,000 a month in cost that he's actually charging to the restaurant, but he's using for home use. So that's a benefit to the owner. And so we add that back because that's a benefit that's, if the new buyer is not going to do that, that's going to be an added $12,000 if it's $1,000 a month a year to the bottom line. So if the owner is getting life insurance, health insurance, disability insurance, any kind of insurances that he's paying himself through the restaurant, expensing, that's a personal benefit that's added back. If he's, his auto expense in a lot of cases is fully being charged to the restaurant, even though it's not used totally for restaurant use. It may be used partially for takeout and delivery, or just going back and forth the restaurant, which technically the IRS will say is okay, but not supposed to charge your personal use of an auto to the restaurant. But that's a very gray area. So there's usually a lot of latitude there, and most owners will write off most of their auto, gas, maintenance, lease payments, whatever. Okay, depreciation, what does that mean? That's the obsolescence of equipment. The government allows you, when you buy a piece of equipment, a major piece of equipment, you can write it off over a number of years, 5 to 7 years. So if you're buying a big piece of equipment like a refrigerator, a freezer, a stove, you can actually write that off, depreciate it. So any depreciation, which is a paper expense, is an add back because it's not an actual monetary expense per se. Although technically you need to keep a reserve for replacement of fixtures and equipment, because ultimately equipment is going to wear out. The life of a stove may be 7-10 years, depending upon the use, etc. So you should have a reserve for that. But nonetheless, the depreciation expense per se is a paper expense and can be added and adjusted to arrive at seller's discretionary earnings. Then if you have a loan, you're the seller. Again, this is from the seller's perspective. You have a loan, that's your loan, the seller's loan, and it's not going to be the buyer's loan. So any interest expense that goes with that loan that's written off as an expense, that's added back to seller's discretionary earnings. Amortization, which means the principal portion of the loan, is added back because we're selling these businesses mainly all cash. And so interest is added back. If there's a net operating loss, which means the seller has had losses in the past and the government allows you to carry those forward so many years. And if he's writing those off, we don't see those often, but if that should be an expense, which reduces the taxable income, obviously the goal of all operators is to lower the taxable income so he pays little or no tax. And so these are, legitimate write-offs that an owner can expense against the business to get his, taxable income to as low as possible. So then also, if there are extraordinary or non-reoccurring expenses, and you're saying, what the hell are those? Okay, suppose you have a lawsuit, sexual harassment, discrimination, you name it. And you have to hire an attorney to defend yourself, and you have legal bills and costs. That's an extraordinary expense. That's not an expense that's going to be a normal expense. So that's an add back. Or extraordinary accounting. Let's say you're having an audit and you have to get your accountant involved in the process, or your tax attorney involved. So those are extraordinary events. Non-reoccurring items Like, for example, during COVID, a non-recurring expense would be building these, outdoor eating areas, these parklets, all the extra sanitizer and the gloves, that they had to incur, and a lot of extraordinary costs. Those are non-reoccurring expenses, and so in the COVID year, and then capital items. So if somebody buys a refrigerator or a freezer, that should really be depreciated over 5 years, but more cases than not, the owner will just expense that item and write it off, that whole thing right up front. Say a $10,000 item, instead of writing it off $2,000 a year over 5 years, they'll go boom, $10,000, reduce my taxable income. So those are items that need to be adjusted as well. All right, so let's get into specifics of what I'm talking about. But before that, let's talk about what are the factors that affect a sales multiplier. So I gave you a little bit of idea of what SDE is, but what goes with that SDE is the multiplier. So if we go down to the second to the last bullet here, we say the multiplier is to be 1 to 3 times SDCF, seller's discretionary cash flow, also referred to as, again, seller's discretionary earnings, for independent, non-franchise, non-chain businesses. So chain operations, franchise multipliers depend on the strength of the company. So if I'm selling a Togo's or a Subway or any other well-known franchise, they have their own set of criteria as to what the multiples are. And so how do we determine what that is? Well, we look at past franchises that we have sold similar to the one that we're talking about, and then we delve deeper and we look at the different businesses for sale websites, see what's being sold, and then we'll drill down and talk to actual brokers that may specialize, or talk to the franchisor themselves, and or talk to the franchisor and find out what is historically, currently, what are the multiples that are used for selling a Subway or a Togo's or whatever the franchise may be. And so that's how we get the data for coming up with the multiple. And sometimes they're higher than 3 times. But generally speaking, 1 to 3 times is the multiple range. Now you say, well, gee, there's a big difference between, if my business is making 200,000, a 1 multiplier would be 200,000, a 3 multiplier would be 600,000. Obviously, there's a big difference there. It's 3 times as much. Well, why do you use a 1 versus a 3? Well, I'll give you an example. Working on a Michelin star restaurant in the peninsula, been around for many, many years. Very high guest check average, $200 plus per person, very fancy cuisine. I think it's French cuisine. The goodwill is tied up into the chef and the owner that's been running this restaurant for many years. And what kind of value is that going to have to a buyer? How is he going to be able to replicate the skill of that chef that's not going to be part of the restaurant when it's sold, because he's 60 some odd years old and he's retiring? And that's one of the motivations for selling the restaurant. So, obviously the risk factor is very high. You're not going to necessarily, keep the same volume, keep the same customer profile, unless you can find a chef equal to, as talented to him, and in front of the house, people equal to or talented, but that's a big risk. And so therefore it's going to be a lower multiplier, probably in the area of 1.5 or so, just guesstimating, depending upon, again, the quality of the leaseholds and the equipment and the lease terms, et cetera. But there again, go back to a business I sold many years ago. It was an a coffee cafe business, similar to a Starbucks or a Pete's. And it was in a location in San Francisco, a very popular retail street. And it'd been there for many years, and it had already been cannibalized, so to speak, by the head-on competitors. There was a Pete's a block away. There was a Starbucks 2 blocks away that had been there for many years. And this coffee cafe was generating, a sizable profit. They're doing about $1 million in sales, and this is all coffee sales, coffee and a few bakery items, which they bought out. Maybe 20% of their sales were bakery, but it was all coffee with, high margins. They were, doing somewhere like 350, 400,000 net. And we ended up selling that place for over $1 million because it was 3 times multiple, I think $1.1 million, $1.2 million, because again, it was an easy to run operation. The risk factor was low. It had already been cannibalized for years. It still maintained its unique customer profile who liked this particular, Italian brand of coffees that this place sold. And it had a reasonable long-term lease, and somebody paid a huge price for it because it's easy to operate, easy to continue the concept. There was obviously training by the owner for at least a 30-day period so that the owner, the new buyer would get all, be able to learn all the nuances of the business and be able to maintain it in its current standards of quality and service, et cetera. So that goes into some of the makeup of, and then also the lease value is important. These other factors, the quality of the leasehold improvements, like, in a going concern, an asset sale, excuse me, the future growth opportunities in the location. Okay, what am I talking about? Maybe this place only serves breakfast and lunch. Okay, well, there may be upside for dinner. Maybe it only operates 5 days a week. Maybe there's a potential to operate 7 days a week. Maybe it only has beer and wine, or doesn't even have beer and wine. So it has the upside for adding beer and wine. Or maybe hard liquor. So you've got upside for additional days of operation, additional hours of operation, additional, amenities you may want to add to the business. So these are factors that affect the sales multiplier. But again, only to an extent. The reality is the buyer is going to buy the business based upon its current performance. If they know they can add dinner, or they can add liquor, or they can add days and hours of operation, there is a risk factor and a cost factor that goes with that. So they're not going to pay for that. They're going to pay for the current performance of the business. And their motivation, part of their motivation to buy the business, is the upside that they perceive is possibly there. But I will give you an example of one of the most reputable breakfast and lunch businesses in San Francisco, Breakfast Lunch. Been around for 30 years. I've sold it, I think, 3 times. And one of the times I sold it, the operator said, great place, great location, great demographics, high-end market. Why not add dinner? And this place had already a preconceived image for 15 years of being one of the best breakfast and lunch places in San Francisco. And they could never really get dinner off the ground. And they actually ended up losing money putting dinner in. So they put dinner in. Didn't work because it had such a preconceived image of breakfast lunch that it didn't generate a kind of dinner business to pay for itself, and they eliminated dinner. So sometimes, so that's an example of the risk factor of time and cost that goes into expanding an operation. So again, that's not going to be factored in the buyer's mind of terms of the price he's going to pay. It will be factored in his mind, the upside in what he could possibly do, but he's not going to pay for that up front. He's going to pay based upon current performance. Okay, so let's go to a specific example. Let's see here. I don't know. Am I getting any questions? Let's see here. I meant to say if there are questions. Okay, I forgot to mention that. I'm sorry about that. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box, but if you do, put your email address as well. Because I may not have time to answer your question, and I will answer them at the end of the show. Okay. So let me go into the specific example of a going concern deal. Let me just get rid of this chart. Okay, cancel. Okay. So what we look at generally is if we're doing a going concern valuation today, we will look at 4 years. Look at, again, in this particular case, I'm talking about the pizza operation, which I mentioned, and it had a great year. It showed $352,000 of net income on the tax return. And then we added back the officer's compensation, $147,000. He worked in the restaurant. The interest expense, depreciation expense, amortization expense, the 401k for the owner and the owner's vacation, term life insurance for the owners, and he bought a stand-up freezer, which again should have been capitalized, not expensed. So he had $200,000 of add backs. So his total cash flow was actually $553,000. So we take that 553, and again, we used a multiplier of 2.5 because again, this is a pizza operation, easy to learn, been established for many years, It's already been cannibalized, so you're not likely to have head-on competition coming into the immediate market. So sales are going to be stable in the future. And so we take that through 553,000, multiply it by the multiple of 2.5, and we come up with 1,384,000. Now, if somebody wants to buy the saleable inventory, which obviously if it's a going concern, they do, which is the food, the beverage, food, cleaning supplies, paper supplies, they pay for that extra in addition to that price. So we looked at 2020. We do the same exercise for 2021. I'm sorry, I skipped 2021. Let me go back. So same general concept, take the net income, add back all the particulars. Here, they basically put a new roof on and they wrote the whole thing off over, the year that they generated the expense versus capitalizing it, and added back all the benefits to the seller, came up with 544,000 of seller's discretionary earnings, used a multiple 2.5, came up with 1,360,000. Did the same thing for 2022. What happened in 2022, although sales were fairly stable, they didn't react quickly enough in terms of raising their prices. As you probably know, from COVID on, prices of food products have gone up dramatically. And obviously the market is only going to bear, so much increase. You've got to maintain price value. So you can't offset your increases dollar for dollar. But they didn't take advantage of, they could have raised their prices a little bit and they didn't do that. So therefore their margin was less. They dropped down to 155,000 that year. So their value, dropped to, 378,000 or times a multiple, 946,550. And then, so what we do is did the same thing in 2023, obviously is an important year because usually the most current year subject to any major, problems that year, i.e. COVID, the Great Recession, the dot-com boom, et cetera. But so 2023 is somewhat stabilized. We only did this, originally January to March. I just actually redid this yesterday through July. And the way it's coming out for July, if we take we took the year to date, since there's not a lot of seasonal fluctuation in income. It's a pretty steady neighborhood type location, where some locations are very seasonal if they're tourist oriented or convention oriented, et cetera. But in this case, they're very steady. So we looked at basically about a $980,000 value based upon taking the 7 years worth 7 months, of seller's discretionary earnings and annualizing them. So in this case, just to show you how we do the annualization, we took the actual 83,000, which represents 3 months, and we divide that by 3, the 83. So we come up with 27,000 a month times 12, and then we annualize it, come up with 334, and we multiply times 2.5. So the bottom line on this whole thing is we do an average weighted value average. So we look at those 4 years. And I next weight the past 4 years to determine the recommended value. 2023, the most recent year, is given the most weight and is assigned a 35% value. So we annualized those first 3 months, used a 35% weight factor, and 2022 is given a 30% weight factor. This is somewhat subjective based upon the agent's the broker's experience in doing valuation. 21 is given a 20% weight factor, and 20 is given a 15% weight factor. Again, the whole basis is that most current financials generally, unless there are exceptional things going on in the economy, is most indicative of the future. That's why we put the heaviest weight factor. So by doing the average weighted factor, we came up with 992,779. So this is obviously a lot of information. And if you want more information, feel free to contact me, and I'm going to throw my contact information up here. There it is. My email address is steve@restaurantrealty.com. I can be reached at this number. This is our general number, and you'll hear in the directory, you hear my name. Just hit my button and leave a message, and I will get back to you. So, and again, this has been published, this presentation has been published in my most recent newsletter, or part of it has been. And hopefully you've learned something from this. So in concluding, I would like to first of all just mention briefly that our next Dealmaker session is going to be on September 21. I will have a co-host then. Maybe you listening today are saying, oh, thank God, I don't have to listen to him by myself. But I have a very interesting co-host. His name is Andrew Rogerson. And I've known Andrew for many years. We've been fellow members of the California Association of Business Brokers, the International Business Broker Association, and Mergers and Acquisition Source. And Andrew is an expert in business acquisition. He's been in sales for 26 plus years. He's owned 5 successful businesses. He's author of 4 books. He's also a fabulous speaker, and he's got a great Australian accent, which really ties the whole thing up. Our October show, October 26th, is going to be Michael Baker, who is a client. He was actually a buyer of Pizzalina. We actually featured the seller, Laura, a few months ago, and very successful background as a chef owner prior to selling Pizzalina. He's actually building his second Pizzalina now in Walnut Creek. He was executive chef of Chalet restaurants that have 5 restaurants doing $21 million. And he was executive chef of the whole chain. And he's also been a chef at Cafe Reggio, and he's a graduate of Johnson and Wales chef school. So he'll be interesting from the kitchen management side, kitchen ownership side. And then in November, our own Jeremy Brockman, who is our marketing director, will be talking about cutting edge marketing techniques to assure our success and other people's success to be competitive now and in the future. So that sort of gives you an overview for the future. And again, thank you for joining us today. And again, if you want to get in touch with me, there's my information, and we appreciate your participation. So everyone enjoy the remaining, I guess technically we have another, 2 weeks or less than 2 weeks, about a week and a half until Labor Day. So everybody enjoy the rest of the summer, and most importantly, stay well. And thanks again for joining us. Take care.